10 Odd Facts and Unusual Tales about Serial Killers. The public's fascination with serial killers seems endless, reflected in the countless movies, TV shows, and books centered around these chilling figures. While fictional murderers capture our imaginations, the real-life stories of serial killers often prove even more bizarre and unnerving. Delving into the lives and crimes of infamous killers, we uncover tales that surpass the wildest fictional narratives. Here are 10 strange but true stories involving some of history's most notorious serial killers. The public's infatuation with serial killers seems to have no end. Today's culture has a large number of fictitious murderers, thanks to innumerable films, TV series, and novels. We might believe that with all this coverage, we know exactly what motivates and how serial killers operate. Nevertheless, the tales of the actual murderers are frequently much stranger than those of their fictional equivalents. Number 10. Ted Bundy and Debbie Harry. Debbie Harry, the lead singer of Blondie, has stated on multiple occasions over the past few decades that she almost missed Ted Bundy, one of the country's most infamous serial killers. The narrative was first told by her in 1989. It was someplace in New York's Village in the early 1970s. Debbie was out on the streets late at night, attempting to hail a cab. A guy in a little automobile was following her and continued trying to offer to give her a ride. She finally gave in, since she was unable to locate a cab. Debbie knew as soon as she entered that something wasn't right. The car was completely disassembled and lacked any interior handles. Debbie was able to squeeze her arm through the partially shattered window, grasp the outside handle, unlock the door, and jump out as the vehicle started to back away. She learned that Ted Bundy had nearly kidnapped her when she saw the same man on television several years later. Is Debbie's account accurate? It's doubtful, but not feasible to determine for sure. Bundy ought to have been in the Pacific Northwest at the time, based on what is known about his movements. It doesn't appear that he visited New York City at all. Moreover, Bundy was known to favor a regular Volkswagen Beetle to a unique kidnapping vehicle. Number 9. Investigating H.H. Holmes. American Ripper is a new television program that debuted in the summer of 2017 on the History Channel. It was hosted by Jeff Mudgett, the great-great-grandson of infamous American serial killer H.H. Holmes, and it looked into the possibility that Holmes was also Jack the Ripper. The show did, however, put an end to the century-old story that Holmes somehow bribed his way to freedom and fled to South America, despite the extremely thin relationship between the two killers. The origin of the rumor is uncertain, but it might have begun with the murderer's peculiar request. Holmes requested to be laid to rest in a cement-covered, double-deep coffin. Like he did to many of his victims, he wished to stop others from desecrating his body. At the request of Holmes's heirs, a judge authorized the cement tomb's excavation around 120 years later. The TV show postponed the body's analysis until the season finale, but it did stimulate fresh interest in the case and the rumor of his escape. After examining the remains, Samantha Cox, an anthropologist from the University of Pennsylvania, determined that they belonged to H.H. Holmes. The killer's body was kept in fascinating conditions by the unusual burial. His clothes and mustache were virtually well preserved, but the corpse had decomposed to the point that his DNA could no longer be used. It was determined by using Holmes's teeth. Number 8. Brutal siblings. You usually become the family's bad apple when you're accused of 6 murders. Varen Jonathan Nakada Ludena, a migrant worker from Peru, is accused of killing 6 individuals in a series of home invasions in Kumagaya, Japan, although that may not always be the case. This is due to the fact that his older brother is regarded as Peru's most prolific serial killer. Pedro Pablo Nakada Ludena, often known as El Apostol de la Muerte, killed 25 people between the years 2000 and 2006. He waited for God to tell him whom to kill while strolling around Lima's streets. Typically, he would target homosexuals, drug addicts, and prostitutes. In the end, he was found guilty of 17 murders and given a 35-year prison term. Veyron and a few of his siblings were able to relocate to Japan at that same time in search of employment. Their sister, Maria Espejo, claims that Veyron was quite upset to learn of his brother's transgressions. She claimed that Veyron returned with a different man from the one he had met when he visited Pedro in jail in Peru. He withdrew inside himself, ate very little, and whined that everyone was upset with him. She eventually lost communication with him. 10 years later, Veyron Ludena was the main suspect in the 3-day murderous rampage that occurred in Saitama Prefecture. After attempting suicide and falling from a second-story window while being chased by the police, he later suffered a fractured skull. According to the boy's relatives, both of them have paranoid schizophrenia. Number 7, champion of the light heavyweight class and serial killer. The Hammersmith nude murders were a string of prostitution-related deaths that afflicted London in the early 1960s. The killer was known by the media as Jack the Stripper, since all of the victims were discovered nude. A police superintendent, a security officer by the name of Mungo Ireland, and a Met detective were among the several dozen persons named as suspects in the killings. The most fascinating suspect, though, is Freddie Mills, a former light heavyweight world boxing champion. The main source of the accusation is former mobster Jimmy Tippett. He was formerly a part of the underworld in London, and his father was a boxer who knew Mills well. Tippett therefore asserts that he spoke with numerous informed sources who were aware of Freddie's tendency to cause pain, both inside and outside the ring. But none of them made any official statements. The notion that Mills might have been involved was sparked by his suicide in 1965, which coincidentally occurred a few months before the final murder in Hammersmith. Numerous explanations have surfaced since then that purport to explain his demise. According to one, Mills was killed by criminals in order to collect unpaid debts. According to someone else, the former boxer was truly bisexual and grieving for his partner, British crooner Michael Holliday. Tippett claims that Mills committed suicide because he knew he would soon be taken into custody in connection with the killings. Freddie Mills was rejected as a candidate by Nipper Reed, the detective investigating the suicide. According to Reed, there might have been some confusion at the time because Mungo Ireland, a former boxer in his 40s who committed suicide in 1965, was also the police's primary suspect at the time. Number 6, mass murderer versus serial killer. Prison officials face challenges while dealing with the public's increased scrutiny on notorious offenders, while also having to protect these criminals from other inmates who may wish to harm them. Serial killer Joel Rifkin and mass murderer Colin Ferguson were two notorious residents of the Supermax Jail Attica Correctional Facility in New York in 1994. They were not friends. Up to 17 women, mostly prostitutes, were slain by Rifkin, and Ferguson was accountable for the 1993 shooting incident on the Long Island Railroad that left 6 people dead and over 20 injured. For a ridiculous reason, the two prisoners got into a quarrel. Rifkin's insistence on being loud while Ferguson was on the phone infuriated Ferguson. The argument then turned to boasting about their transgressions. Ferguson made fun of Rifkin's preference for ladies, saying that he wiped out 6 devils instead. Rifkin, meanwhile, claimed to have killed far more people. After that, Ferguson attacked Rifkin, turning the argument into a brawl. Neither prisoner suffered any major wounds. 2 decades prior, the California murderers Ed Kemper and Herbert Mullin shared adjacent cells in a similar situation. Despite Kemper's significant advantage over Mullen, there were no violent confrontations. However, Kemper, also known as the Coed Killer, did relate stories of doing behavioral treatment and other experiments on Mullen. Number 5. From Valor to Murder. One of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history was apprehended with the assistance of Tracy Edwards in 1991. Edwards had managed to break out of Jeffrey Dahmer's mansion and was now strolling the streets of Milwaukee while tied and half-naked. Edwards then escorted the cops to Dahmer's flat. That's the location where, during a 4-year period, the latter slaughtered, dismembered, and ate 16 victims. Edwards was praised as a hero for his role in putting an end to the Milwaukee cannibals' homicidal reign after his story made front-page news across the nation. However, Edwards was detained and accused of murder 2 decades later. Not surprised, the encounter with Dahmer altered his life irrevocably. Edwards has been involved in other drug-related legal run-ins since that time, and he has spent at least 10 years bouncing between homeless shelters. When Edwards was charged with plunging a man off a bridge to his death in 2011, he reached his lowest point. It was later discovered by the police that Edwards had gotten into a brawl with 2 other homeless males. One of them drowned after falling off a bridge. Ultimately, the other individual was charged with reckless endangerment, and Edwards received a sentence of only 1.5 years in jail for aiding and abetting a felon. Number 4, it's a family thing. Ivan Milat used the Belanglo State Forest in Australia's New South Wales as his murderous grounds in the early 1990s. At least 7 backpackers, the most of whom were foreign visitors to Australia, were shot, stabbed, strangled, and bludgeoned by Milat over the course of 4 years. He was captured in 1994 and is incarcerated for several life terms. In 2012, Matthew Milat, his great-nephew, was charged with a crime resembling his uncle's callousness. On David Auchterlonie's 17th birthday, Matthew and his friend Cohen Klein killed him by striking him in the skull with an axe while recording the incident on a cell phone. David was enticed by the youths to the Belanglo State Forest, where, 20 years earlier, Ivan Milat had preyed on hikers. While Klein was filming, Matthew Milat, who was also 17 at the time, killed someone, and the 2 later posed for photos with the body. Judge Jane Matthews claims that Milat later wrote poetry in which he boasted about the kill and said, "That's what the Milats do." After that, Milat and Klein received prison sentences of 43 and 32 years, respectively. Number 3, the hellish trial. The Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, went on a killing spree, yet his trial gained almost as much notoriety as his murders. He was well known for his attention-grabbing acts, which included yelling, "Hail Satan!" writing pentagrams on his hands, and grinning and waving to the victims' families. There was a real fear at one time that Ramirez would shoot the prosecutor in the courtroom and then shoot the crowd. He boasted to jail staff about having connections who could smuggle a gun to him. All participants were searched before entering the courtroom after a metal detector was placed outside. Up until the O.J. Simpson trial in 1994, this trial was the most costly in California history, ultimately costing over $1.8 million. However, given that a juror's murder nearly led to a mistrial, it might have been even more expensive. Phyllis Singletary was her name, and she passed away not long after the prosecutor was threatened. The other jurors couldn't suppress their suspicion that Ramirez was somehow responsible for this and that they also were in jeopardy. Some jurors were too afraid to go back to their houses at night, even though they weren't sequestered. Ultimately, it was discovered that Ramirez had nothing to do with Singletary's murder. After a domestic argument, James Cecil Melton, her partner, killed her. He later murdered himself in a hotel room, and in his suicide note, he confessed to killing her. Number 2, summers spent with Stephen Morin. In the summer of 1981, Chris Clark, at 21, got to know Ray Constantine, the new boyfriend of his mother. Chris had no idea at the time that this was actually Stephen Morin's identity, an infamous serial killer who killed up to 30 women around the country. Because of his mother's poor judgment in men, Chris was first wary of the new man in her life. But Ray persuaded him to change his mind by securing Chris a union position on a painting crew. Throughout the summer, Ray and Chris collaborated on projects together, and Ray even saved Chris's life once. Chris was on a 3-story ladder when it started to go off the house, and he froze in terror. Ray ran to the 3rd level and hung out the window after spotting this from the yard. He began by talking Chris out of his fear and persuading him to reposition the ladder. Ray next fastened it firmly to the window frame. As their relationship deepened, Chris never considered offering assistance until he dropped by his mother's house one day. Inside her van, Ray was fastening rugs to the walls and ceiling with rivets. Chris didn't know until much later that he had assisted in soundproofing a van, allowing a cruel murderer to rape and torture victims within. Number 1, incomplete through technology. Dennis Rader, often known as BTK, was a notorious serial murderer from Wichita who was caught after giving a floppy disk to the media without realizing it could be linked to him. Because he was a bad computer user, he wasn't the first murderer to be apprehended, though. 3 years prior, Missouri murderer Maury Travis, who claimed to have killed 17 women, experienced a similar situation. Travis desired media exposure just like Rader did. Teresa Wilson was one among the victims, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published a heartfelt story about her in May 2002. Her killer wrote them an anonymous letter boasting about all the murders the police had not yet solved. He also included a map of West Alton, Missouri, with an X on it, and offered to lead them to another body. Luckily for the authorities, Travis had no idea what IP tracking meant. They were able to ascertain that the map originated from Expedia.com first. They then obtained the IP addresses of every person who had recently viewed a map of West Alton using a federal subpoena. West Alton had 500 residents, so it wasn't exactly a thriving city. Actually, there was only one outcome. Microsoft was the next to receive the IP address. They directed authorities to Maury Troy Travis, a 36-year-old. Investigators discovered torture devices, blood spatter, and video recordings of some of the atrocities inside his house. These tales remind us that the reality of serial killers often eclipses fiction in terms of strangeness and horror. While fictional depictions offer a glimpse into the twisted minds of these criminals, the real-life events reveal a more complex and unsettling truth. As society continues to be captivated by these dark figures, it's essential to remember the victims and the impact of these heinous crimes on their families and communities.